welcome and thanks for joining us for the fourth ReThink Health Toolbox webinar. My name is Leila Hussain, and I'm the Deputy Director of Communications at the Ripple Foundation. If you are new to Ripple or to this webinar series, we're thrilled to have you. I do want to let you know and assure you that though this is a webinar series, you do not need to have attended prior webinars in order to fully engage with the material that we'll be sharing today. And I'll talk a little bit more about that series. So just, to orient us today, I wanted to briefly share where we've been, where we are, and what's coming up for this series. We launched the ReThink Health Toolbox webinar series last year and have had 3 webinars so far, with today being our 4th. As you can see on this slide, past webinars that we've covered have included a introduction to the vital conditions for health and well-being, an introduction to shared stewardship, an overview of belonging and civic muscle, and recordings of those webinars are available on our site, along with resources if you're interested. Today is the 4th webinar in the series on multisolving, and our next webinar will be in March and will cover the 3 Horizons framework. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of our presentation. Allow me to set the stage for our time together today. The intent of the ReThink Health Toolbox webinar series is really to help us all embrace our role in transformative change. It's also a way for us at the Ripple Foundation to share a 101 level introduction to ReThink Health's tools, practices, and frameworks that are proven to drive that transformative change. Today, our primary intention is that each of us, no matter where we are along our journey, walks away with a basic understanding of what we mean by multi-solving and how impactful the strategy can be. Our speakers will share examples and stories to help bring the concept of multi-solving to life. And towards the end of the hour, we'll open it up to you all for Q&A. A few practical notes on norms. Please feel free to share your questions and reflections in the chat as we go. We'll address them as best as we can live, and we'll also cover them during Q&A. If you would like to access closed captions or live transcription, we've enabled those functions, which you can initiate in the bottom ribbon of your screen. You should see the closed caption icon with a little caret next to it, where you can adjust your settings. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to message me in the chat. We also encourage you to turn your camera on if possible. Take a look around the room and notice friends or even connections yet to be made. I see a lot of familiar faces here today and also many new folks, and we're honored to have all of you here. Lastly, please note that the link to the recording from today's presentation, along with the slides and supporting material, will be emailed to you within a week or so, and will also be made available on our website. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our presenters for today, Molly Belsky, Program Associate, and Joanne King, Program Director. And now I'll turn it over to Molly.
Thank you, Leila. I'm really happy to see you all today. Welcome. I'm just going to go over the intentions for today's discussion on multi-solving. We're going to introduce the practice of multi-solving and why it matters. And we'll work to understand what multi-solving looks like in practice and see some examples of its use. And then we're going to explore how you can start multi-solving in your own work. Next slide, please. So for today's discussion, we've whittled multi-solving down to what we think are the basics. We'll go through 5 W's, which is the who, what, where, why, and when, and then 1 H, the how. Next slide, please. So before we dive into all that, I do want to get just a lay of the land from all of you, just to understand what previous knowledge you're bringing to this. So Sierra, you will see that first poll pop up in a minute. Whether you've never heard the term before, the term multi-solving before, or you've come across it elsewhere, we just want to know your current understanding of it. So is it a new name for how you usually think and act, a promising practice that you'd like to develop further, something important, but you don't know where to begin, a distraction from quick, direct problem solving, or something too good to be true? So we'll just, looks like we've got people answering right now. So we'll give you all just a couple of minutes. Just a few more responses. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and show you all. We have a lot of people who think it's a promising practice that they'd like to develop further. So I'm so glad that you're here, and also to help you figure out where to begin. And a lot of people that recognize it as a way that you normally think and act. And we have one person who thinks it's something too good to be true, which you are a great person to have along in this journey, because we need to make sure that we are developing practical solutions and avoiding some of that magical thinking that we can get tied down in, if we're too quick to move forward. So next slide, please. All right. So the first W is what? Multi-solving is a way of understanding and approaching the complex problems so that we can prioritize the most impactful solutions. So in the most simplest of terms, you can think of it as one action with many benefits. I like to think of it as killing two birds with one stone, or its much gentler iteration, feeding two birds with one scone approach. You find one solution or implement one policy, and that advances more than one of your interests or priorities. Next slide, please. So to dive a little more into the what, the term multi-solving was coined by Dr. Elizabeth Sawin, who realized the simplicity and practicality of multi-solving while she was serving as the co-director for Climate Interactive. And there she recognized that climate solutions also hold immense potential to improve physical health and economic well-being, and that they can even advance and strengthen equity. And seeing all those as areas that are bound up in each other rather than as discrete issues to be solved one by one inspired her to develop and to educate others on the concept of multi-solving and to create the Multisolving Institute. So as she says here, solving problems together might even be easier than trying to tackle each one individually. And I think we might even be joined today by some of our friends from the Multisolving Institute, so welcome. And I want to note that some of the resources you'll see later in this presentation and that we'll provide you at the end come from Dr. Sawin and the Multisolving Institute. So we owe a lot to them in this journey. Next slide, please. So where does multi-solving show up in the world and when? The reality is that once you grasp the concept and the notion of multi-solving, you're going to start seeing it showing up everywhere. You all almost certainly already multi-solve in big and small ways in your daily lives. When we all checked in, you shared an example of a kitchen utensil you use for many purposes. So you already have an idea of the concept. One of my favorite ways to get around my neighborhood in New York is by cycling. And that's a personal multi-solver for me because it allows me outside time and physical activity, both of which are really, really important to my own mental and physical health. It saves me a lot of money and it helps me understand and feel connected to my own community. So it really builds my own sense of belonging. And it's also, cycling is an environmentally friendly way to travel. So it holds benefits for the community by way of reducing carbon emissions and reducing traffic. There are also a lot of multi-solvers of examples of multi-solvers as community or social good initiatives. And depicted on this slide is one that I really love. This is a photo of the Grand Pause program. And in this program, groups of volunteers, including individuals living in senior homes or who frequent senior centers, receive a photo of a senior dog housed in a shelter. And those volunteers then use that photo to paint a picture of the dog, which the shelters then use to help spur on their adoption. So just a really heartwarming example. And I'd like to pause and just hear from you all real quick. What are some benefits that you hear from this program? And you can shout it out or just put it in the chat. Dogs find homes, absolutely, huge benefit. Sense of purpose, creating community among participants, absolutely. Dogs that are harder to place. Yes, we know that senior dogs, senior animals can be more difficult to place from shelters. Seniors have a way to exercise their brains and talents and their dexterity, creative outlet, companionship. Awesome. Yes, so you're already really pretty adept at spotting some of the ways that multi-solving exists all around you already. And I'm sure all of you are even beginning to think about the initiatives that you know of that are great examples of multi-solving. So for this example, we don't actually know whether the creators of the Grand Pause program were intentionally aiming to multi-solve or not. So we're going to delve into further into the actual practice of multi-solving. And to do that, let's look at another example where the change makers involved were intentionally setting out to craft elegant solutions that addressed multiple interconnected problems. So the Thriving Together Springboard, which you can see here, was an effort born out of the multi-layered crises that came to a head in 2020. Changemakers realized in 2020 that not only were these crises, the crises that were happening, deeply entwined with each other, but that our traditional problem-solving methods that were built to solve problems one by one would be ineffective in truly creating change. So in that year, over 8 weeks, from May to June, more than 100 people and organizations worked together to craft Thriving Together, a springboard for equitable recovery and resilience in communities across America. The guiding framework that they laid out wasn't meant to tell us what to do and what not to do or how to act specifically. Instead, it organized in plain fashion the things that all people and places need in order to thrive together, or the vital conditions framework that you may have heard about in a previous Toolbox webinar. And these helped lay out a path, as they say here, not to be narrowly focused problem fixers, but a network of system-focused stewards and multi-solvers. Next slide, please. So the urgency of the moment in which the springboard was created begins to get us into the why of multi-solving. Why should you become a multi-solver? And to delve a little bit more into some of the benefits you might find as you begin multi-solving, we have this list here. I'm not going to read out the entire thing, but just to highlight a couple of these benefits. Multi-solving can help you to avoid solving one problem while making others worse, as it kind of demands that you look at the whole picture and understand the whole spectrum of problems to be solved rather than each one individually. It also requires that you call on diverse perspectives, which can help you to strengthen support for difficult to enact policies and find higher leverage for lasting systems change. And all that is to say that multi-solving as a new way to find and consider solutions is a break from business as usual thinking, which can knock down arbitrary silos in which we are used to working and can really help advance a new way to thrive together. Next slide, please. So the last W is who. Who are multi-solvers? And I have taken a look at the registration list that we have here several times, and I know many of you on the call today, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that each of you are multi-solvers, whether you know it or not. Joanne is going to get into how you might already be doing this and how you can hone your practice in just a minute. But for now, let's look at some of the characteristics that can define a multi-solver, and I'm sure you'll all start to see yourselves in this list. Multi-solvers are rooted in the places where they live and work, and their understandings of the unique characteristics of their own places allows them to see the relationships between issues that might not be immediately obvious. And related to that, they are systems thinkers, seeing the interconnections between these issues in a way that allows them to see unique opportunities and leverage points. They're also creative and persistent, and they're able to generate solutions in ways that others haven't, and understand that big change takes time and consistent effort. They're also connectors, which is an essential element of solving problems across those traditional silos. And lastly, they are reframers, and they see success in broad terms, optimizing many variables rather than only one. So I want to pause now and leave this on the screen as you digest this and consider how you as an individual are a multi-solver. And note that it's also important that organizations themselves, the organizations in which we work, are engaged in this practice. So we're going to do a quick second poll, and we'd like you to think about your own organization and consider which of these characteristics your organization most embodies. This is totally anonymous. This is just to think about how your organization already works. And this can help you see some of the important ways that you might be able to influence your organization to shift towards the practice of multi-solving. Okay. I'll have a few more answers come through, and then I will share the poll result. All right, so unsurprisingly, we have a lot of systems thinkers in this room, and I know the poll only allowed you to choose one. So systems thinkers being the top one makes a lot of sense. We've also got a lot of connectors, a lot of rooted in place. So this is a great place to start and get you kicked off thinking about this. I'm now going to hand it to my colleague Joanne to dive even more into the how.
Great. Thanks, Molly, and hi, everyone. And we just want to say welcome again for taking part in today's conversation. And we know it's really hard to pull like that to just choose the one, but it was really interesting to say and to see what you all think is the characteristic that most embodies the work of your organization. So far, Molly has done a great job of walking us through the 5 W's, the who, what, where, why, when. And within this next portion of the webinar, we're going to be transitioning a bit and talking about the 1 H, or how. So I will be sharing some context on how multi-solving relates to and is integrated within our guiding frameworks and incorporated in some of our tools and resources. We'll share what this looks like within the context of the work that we do here at Ripple Foundation, and especially when we're working in partnership with other entities. So I think Layla, at the very start of today's webinar, did such a great job at showing a roadmap. So what have we covered so far, and what are the topics that are to come? As we move through the next few slides, for those who have joined on some of the previous sessions of these Toolbox webinars, you'll likely note that there will be language, certain concepts and frameworks that hopefully are familiar to you. And that's because they've been discussed in greater depth before. And as Layla mentioned, of course, all of the previous recordings are available on our website for those of you who either want a refresher, or for those who may be coming newer to this content and may want to delve more deeply. But again, there was no need for you to participate in any of the earlier webinars in order to take part in the conversation today. Our intention in repeating some of the information that was shared before is to make reference to principles and practices that already have been shared, and not just repetition for repetition's sake, because we hope that you'll start to see how all of these pieces are starting to fit together. And especially as we begin to introduce new ways of working, including through the application and use of tools and resources. Our aim today, again, is to give a high-level overview of how the practice of multi-solving can be activated to live out our shared ethos of all people and places thriving together without exception, which of course is what we introduced at the very start and which ties all of this together. Next slide. So to that end, the slide here shows the 15 stewardship practices that emerged following years of our field work, and it provides a blueprint of how to think and act in ways that unlock the potential of people everywhere to thrive and to experience optimal well-being. So we do this through connecting across differences, creating transformative opportunities, and learning and adapting. And you see in the center that one means for creating transformative opportunities is through a commitment to multi-solve. And I do want to call out this specific language about making a commitment to multi-solve, which speaks to being really mindful and intentional about this practice in the ways in which you think, in the ways in which you approach your work individually, and as Molly had referenced, the context of your affiliated organization as well. When you look across the 15 and you pan out, you can see that they're not mutually exclusive, and that's intentional as well, which means that in committing to multi-solve, as we've defined, you likewise are expanding aspirations, you're strengthening interdependence, weaving vested interests, and embracing complexity and working towards systems change. And for that last one, Molly, of course, had well pointed out that a number of our pressing societal issues that we face are interrelated, which speaks to the complexity. Next slide. So I'll be moving through these next few slides fairly quickly, but I did want to review what it is that we mean when we refer to urgent services, and you can see them on the right-hand column. And those are services that are defined as temporarily needed to regain or restore well-being when facing adversity. And the next slide, please. And urgent services are distinct from the vital conditions, which are defined as the things that all people need all the time to be healthy and to reach their full potential. And they include basic needs for health and safety, lifelong learning, meaningful work and wealth, humane housing, a thriving natural world, reliable transportation, and belonging and civic muscle. The next slide, please. And taken together, we have what we call the well-being portfolio, and you'll note that belonging and civic muscle is intentionally situated at the center. Belonging and civic muscle is our way of talking about the capacities of people and institutes that convey an inherent sense of belonging, and it's accompanied by the power to influence the policies, practices, and programs that shape our world. And of course, I do want to point out that belonging and civic muscle is both a vital condition, and it's also a practical capacity that's needed for equitable success across all aspects of the well-being portfolio, which in essence makes belonging and civic muscle itself a multi-solver. So when engaging in multi-solving, a question is, how do you put it into practice? As an example, you may have a group of individuals coming together who represent diverse and perhaps seemingly conflicting perspectives. They may have been brought together and given the charge of collaboratively identifying strategies to improve population health and well-being. So if you do have these seemingly diverse perspectives, where do you begin? A practical way to begin is by identifying an organizing framework with an established set of domains, such as the vital conditions framework. And we can think of a framework as a supporting structure from which to build. Using a shared framework to engage in multi-solving allows for a shared vocabulary and shared perspectives in naming and understanding the context of both societal challenges as well as potential solutions. If you're using a unifying framework, it can help level the playing field and also minimize confusion, allowing you to pose a question from a starting premise like, what in our community currently poses the biggest threats to the vital condition of health and safety? And does this same pose a threat to any other vital condition at the same time? Or on the flip side, a starting premise can be a question such as, what are potential solutions that we can employ to improve reliable transportation for those within our shared community? And if we were to effectively implement the solution to improve reliable transportation, might it also improve our thriving natural world and/or any other vital conditions at the same time? So earlier on, Molly had shared examples of multi-solving out in the world, and we have a few others to share that will help us delve into the how. So next slide, please. And then one more. Thank you. I'm now going to share an example of how this played out in recent efforts across the federal government in terms of use of the vital conditions. It's the story of the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience, which lays out an approach for federal agencies and departments to cooperatively strengthen the vital conditions to improve individual and community resilience and well-being in every corner of our country. And the origin story of the federal plan is that it came into being during the height of the COVID pandemic and was designed in part as a governmental counterpart to the Thriving Together Springboard. And that's a little bit of what Molly had referenced earlier on. The pandemic a few years back, of course, had shown a very bright and unmistakable light on the disparities that have long existed in our country and that were made exponentially worse, of course, upon the introduction of this deadly virus. Now, this plan wasn't being asked for by anyone, but there were a group of leaders across our federal government who felt it was needed and that the timing was critical in order to unpack the underlying conditions that were causing consistent disparities across our country. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows the cross-cutting recommendations that resulted. And from a broad standpoint, the federal plan as a whole called for a transformational systemic change in federal government through actions that would align all relevant federal government entities to strengthen the vital conditions, foster community-centered collaboration within and outside of government, maximize investments within existing agency authority in order to strengthen systems for resilience and well-being, and also to achieve equity and to aspire to eliminate disparities through a sustained whole-of-government approach that included provision of services to communities that had been marginalized. The final version of the plan included 78 recommendations, which were published a little over a year ago. And to get to the successful outcome, there was a federal working group who helped steer this work, and they needed to break away from business as usual and dismantle silos. They needed to craft a new type of conversation to help individuals from different agencies and departments see and identify how the work that they were doing was interconnected with the work of others. So governmental peers working in different agencies and different departments. It was beginning the conversation and the deliberation from a very different starting point and making clear at the onset that the recommendations that ultimately would be included in the plan would not just be those that fall within the scope and purview of just one agency or department, because otherwise, why would those need to be included in a more comprehensive federal plan that was meant to span across the government? Instead, the recommendations to be included were those that a singular agency didn't have the autonomy to change on their own, but recommendations that would benefit from the contribution of others from other agencies and other departments. And so what were emerged were cross-cutting recommendations that exhibited tremendous potential to transform the alignment of federal assets through a structural whole of government change. Next slide, please. So not surprisingly, with the type of conversations that were occurring, a natural byproduct of what emerged was that there were a number of multi-solvers that eventually were identified from across the total 78 recommendations in the plan. There were 12 multi-solvers that were found, and you can see a subset of those here on this slide. And for purposes of being labeled a multi-solver for the federal plan itself, these were recommendations that had the ability and were assessed to be able to impact at least 5 or more of the vital conditions. So there was even a heightened threshold applied for what was named a multi-solver for purposes of the plan. You see a few of those multi-solvers here and the vital conditions that they would positively impact through effective implementation. So as an example, one of the multi-solvers identified was to expand access to broadband. And doing so, of course, would support and enhance the basic needs for health and safety, especially during a time when there was such a reliance on telehealth services. But doing so would also benefit each and every other of the vital conditions as well, because when you expand access to broadband, you allow individuals the enhanced ability to work remotely. And when you have more broadband access, you also allow for students to be able to attend school remotely. And you also allow for connections across individuals and communities through digital means during times when quarantines might have been called for, which also can help to strengthen belonging and civic muscle. So what I think is an important footnote to this story is that it was not the case that the group specifically set out to multi-solve. And it wasn't even that this was a part of their shared vocabulary during the earlier conversations. But by engaging in the work in the way that they were embodying the characteristics of multi-solving and approaching this new opportunity to fundamentally change how government works. And to call back on some of the characteristics of multi-solving that were mentioned earlier on, these stewards in and across the federal government were persistent, they were creative, they were connecting across differences and silos, they were thinking from a systems approach, and they were committed to reframing their conversation and their ways of collaboration. They were committed to showing up differently in their work and in the world. Next slide. So the story of what happened across the federal government landscape is one in which the stewards kind of found themselves to be multi-solving without the vocabulary to name it or even without recognizing it at first. The next story that I wish to share is related to engagement with some of our good partners at the state level. And how this real-world example differs is that this group of stewards from the state of Delaware intentionally and explicitly set out to learn about and practice multi-solving in order to enhance their work. So last month in December, my colleagues and I had the pleasure of spending time with partners in Delaware to train a diverse group of stewards in the practice of multi-solving. And we were invited to provide coaching and guided practice to a coalition in the state who would come together as a part of their ongoing work to inform development of their state health improvement plan for the coming years. So our team took part in a two-day 2023 Delaware State Health Improvement Plan Coalition Summit. And we did so on day one and provided a training on multi-solving so that on day two, the coalition members could apply multi-solving principles and practices and use some of the tools that we created to help them assess and work toward prioritizing strategies that they wanted to implement in the coming years in order to improve the health and well-being of Delawareans. So many individuals and organizations across the state of Delaware truly embody the Thriving Together ethos, and I want to give a shout out and a kudos to them. And part of how this shows up is with an appreciation for organizing efforts for equitable well-being and health using the vital conditions. It's worth knowing that this group in Delaware in part was influenced by what they saw and what they learned from their federal colleagues and what emerged from the federal plan itself. So evidence of this is the fact that when this group was reviewing and assessing data in order to inform development of the Delaware State Health Assessment, all of the information that they gathered and were using for sense making was organized using the vital conditions framework. Knowing all of this about the stewards in Delaware provided such an effective jumping off point for our discussion with this group as we were socializing and training them on multi-solving. Since we could pose broader questions to the group about how to identify whether or the extent to which initiatives could be implemented to benefit one or more of the vital conditions. So as part of our coaching session, we did a little bit more of a deeper dive than what Molly and I presented today. And then we facilitated a group exercise in which we asked them to think through ways in which increasing access to community health workers could strengthen one or more of the vital conditions. So it was really about this practice of multi-solving using a unifying framework of the vital conditions. Given the comprehensive work of CHWs and all of the potential that they hold serving as effective representatives at different community groups, as well as their ability to help patients and clients navigate through service channels, it likely comes as no surprise that what emerged from the group discussion was that CHWs hold tremendous potential to strengthen each vital condition. After we did this group exercise as a whole, we then divided participants into breakout groups so that they could use a tool which we created, and that's the worksheet that you see on the right-hand side of this slide, to engage in individual group dialogue to assess the potential of different initiatives in serving as potential multi-solvers within their state. So there was a group that discussed and assessed the multi-solving potential of an initiative that would increase widespread availability of public transportation that's affordable, frequent, and convenient within and between communities in Delaware. And then there was another group that discussed the multi-solving potential of an initiative that would prioritize the existence and creation of safe, healthy, accessible green and blue community spaces. And then when we came together as a whole group, what emerged from these discussions was not only increase in expansive insights about the multi-solving potential of these two initiatives, such as how creating green spaces and waterways for community access could support and promote a thriving natural world, basic needs for health and safety, and belonging and civic muscle. But what also emerged was a deeper understanding of how to engage in multi-solving among their peers. And that includes thinking more broadly and holistically, and quite honestly, posing more comprehensive questions from various perspectives to assess the potential of different types of community interventions. It was really heartening for all of us from the Ripple team to see how the benefits of multi-solving sunk in. One of the participants who worked in public health mentioned that one of her takeaways was to provide a one-on-one on multi-solving as a part of all of her onboarding for new staff and newcoming members of her team. And there was another participant who mentioned that she wants to incorporate some of what she learned about multi-solving to inform future requests for proposals that are authored by her group and made available by her organization in hopes of compelling applicants to propose initiatives that serve as multi-solvers and benefiting health and well-being. And then again, there were others in the room who mentioned how thinking from a multi-solving perspective helped them to see how interrelated their work is with peers who work in different departments across the state. And this in turn helped them to see and appreciate the need to engage in comprehensive and diverse group work among different partners across the state who are engaged from different perspectives. And so, of course, if we have any partners from Delaware who are logged into the webinar today during the Q&A and discussion sessions shortly to follow, we would, of course, invite you all to chime in if you wish to share any of your own personal lessons, takeaways, or insights that emerged from our time together last month. But for now, just allow me to say thank you for your kind attention, and I will turn things back over to my colleague, Layla.
Thank you so much, Joanne and Molly. A great presentation. Today we've heard an introduction to multi-solving, why it matters, and we've got to see some examples of what it looks like in practice. In addition to the resources shared during today's presentation by our presenters, on this slide are a few links to further examine the 5 W's and the how of multi-solving, which we'll also make available in the chat. Before we move on to the Q&A portion of our time, we hope you'll take a few minutes to fill out a brief survey on today's webinar. Your feedback is very important to us and will help us improve our future offerings. In order to diffuse multi-solving and stewardship across the country and beyond, for it to really take hold as a way to drive transformational change, Ripple is committed to sharing stories of stewardship in action for others to see, learn from, and be inspired by. We heard a lot of great stories today on multi-solving, and we know that there are many, many more. We invite you to share those stories with us, and we will help get them out through our platforms that are dedicated to sharing stories of stewards. And those include the Unsung Stewards podcast and the Stewards Rising campaign, both of which see and celebrate the diverse efforts of stewards. So I really welcome you all to reach out to me directly to share your story if one comes to mind. And as I mentioned earlier at the top of the webinar, our next webinar will take place in March. It's on March 5th. At which time we'll provide an introduction to the 3 Horizons framework. In the simplest terms, the 3 Horizons framework is a useful tool to help stewards bring about systems that create more equitable outcomes for well-being. It's an efficient way to see current systems, imagine better and more sustainable systems, and identify the factors and practices that can either support or hinder the transition to our desired future for health and well-being. Please keep a lookout in your email for updates on that webinar, and you can also register today at the link in the chat. We hope you'll join us.